Period on the DEC's hydrofracking report starts later this summer, but opponents are not waiting any time to start sharing their criticisms. Environmental Advocates of New York released a top 10 list of their concerns about the report. And joining me now to explain those concerns is Catherine Nadeau of Environmental Advocates of New York. Catherine, thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you released this top 10 list of concerns, list of grievances, if you will, on the preliminary draft environmental review of this permitting process for the hydrofracking, high-volume hydrofracking. And some of them are interesting, and one thing that really jumped out right away was the issue of staff reductions at the DEC. This is an issue that the previous commissioner sounded the alarms over, Pete Granis, and even the current commissioner, Joe Martens, who Governor Andrew Cuomo picked to lead the DEC, has said, look, if we are working at our present staff level now, we will have problems in issuing permits. This is an issue that environmentalists have raised, and it's an issue that folks in the gas industry have raised too. But why is this a problem on your end?
Well, basically, the Department of Environmental Conservation has put out this 1,000-plus page document detailing how they intend to oversee gas drilling or fracking in New York State. And there is a lot to like in this document. It's improved over the last draft, but there's still a long, long way to go. And part of the problem is that even for the parts of this that we like, even for the improved protections that the state has included in this draft of the plan, if the Department of Environmental Conservation doesn't have the staff to properly oversee or enforce fracking, or enforce, the rules on fracking, then all of this is just words on paper. What New York really needs are boots on the ground that can be out at drill sites, be watching the drilling happening, the fracking happening, and make sure that all goes according to plan and that it's all done with all the proper protections in place. Otherwise, again, this is just words on paper.
Now, how specialized a worker what kind of a specialized worker is needed for overseeing hydrofracking, for issuing these permits? What's their area of expertise, and just why are they needed to do this?
Well, there's a lot of different types of staff that are needed at Department of Environmental Conservation in order to oversee fracking in New York. We need staffers who can understand the impacts of water withdrawals, because fracking requires a huge amount of water for each well in order to drill, fracture the rock, and get the gas out of the rock. So we need people who understand water. We need people who understand water treatment, because this type of drilling creates an enormous amount of waste. Some of it's toxic, some of it's carcinogenic, and all of it needs to be dealt with somehow. So we need specialists who can deal with that type of waste. We need geologists. We need people who can go out and actually inspect the well pads and inspect what's going on site, so that we can be sure that the levels and the standards of performance are being met out there in the field.
Now, one suggestion that's been made is once the permitting process is up and running, that the state would take these permit fees and be able to put that towards more staff, towards growing people in those departments. Is that something that's possible? Is that something that's doable once hydrofracking begins?
Well, right now, there are a lot of ideas being kicked around, but there is no hard plan for staffing at the Department of Environmental Conservation to oversee this type of drilling, and that is a serious, serious problem. The department has lost about 20% of its workforce in the last 4 years. That's an enormous amount, and unless we reverse this, we're going to see big environmental problems across the board, not just in fracking.
Okay, let's move on to another issue you guys raised in your top 10 list. Yeah. It was actually covered several points, and it's the concern about disposing of hazardous waste. Mm-hmm. Once the hydrofracking process is completed, there's a lot of wastewater left over from this, but in your view, this draft report does not particularly cover that.
Well, it does a better job than the first draft did. It goes further in setting up thresholds and oversight for this wastewater. However, the water that comes back out of these wells includes toxic and carcinogenic chemicals. It's very, very salty, and those things provide a big problem for treatment at any sewage treatment plants that we've got in New York State right now. So what we're calling for is for tests to be done on this water, and that any water that comes back, any of these waste that comes back and is hazardous waste, needs to be treated as hazardous waste and should not be allowed to go to our sewage treatment plants.
Okay, so but why not deal with that now? I mean, like, why isn't it detailed as hazardous waste?
Well, right now under the state regulations, natural gas waste is just by definition not considered hazardous waste.
Okay.
And it doesn't matter what the chemicals are that are in there, it just is by definition not. So what we're saying is if the waste meets the definition as hazardous waste, it needs to be treated as hazardous waste. This is one of the regulations that needs to be changed if Governor Cuomo wants to allow drilling in New York.
Is it more expensive to dispose of hazardous waste? Is that part of the issue here?
There's a big price tag attached to that, certainly, and there's a lot of higher standards that need to be met for that type of waste disposal.
Okay. And the issue of watersheds, actually, when this report came out, I think we talked a little bit about the fact that part of this drilling does not include the New York City and Syracuse watersheds. But in other watersheds, this is allowed. What's the issue there, and in your view, what's the problem?
Well, right now, this sets up a system where New York City and Syracuse watersheds, there will be no drilling allowed. Also, the proposal includes no drilling over primary aquifers, which is groundwater that provides drinking water for bigger municipalities. But what it doesn't include are types of protections for people who just rely on well water across the state. And so it sets up a very interesting dynamic. Basically, Department of Environmental Conservation is saying that they're not certain that this can be done safely. It's not necessarily safe enough to be done in the Syracuse and the city watersheds. So our question is then, all right, so then how can this be okay for the rest of the state?
Okay. So what's our next step here in terms of the public comment period, seeing the eventual next draft SGEIS of this?
So coming up next, the state is going to release its next draft of the report. It should be out. The Department of Environmental Conservation is saying the end of the summer. So we'll be looking for that then. Once the next draft is out, the official public comment period begins, and people can weigh in on that through the Department of Environmental Conservation's website, through Environmental Advocates of New York's website. We'll be sending out alerts to all of our members, urging them to weigh in. And people can, of course, just write and call. The department has proposed a 60-day comment period. Because this is such a humongous draft, it's a technical document, it's one that's going to take time to get through and that people need to understand. We're calling on the state to do at least 180 days of comment period and public hearings across the state to make sure that New Yorkers whose daily lives are going to be impacted by this type of drilling have the opportunity to really weigh in.
Based on the current timetable, though, that the state has laid out so far, if permits are approved, when's the earliest that permit can be sent out?
Yeah, it all depends on how this unfolds, of course, but Commissioner Martens had said that they're expecting the earliest they would be able to go forward would be very early next year. So, again, it all depends on the timeline, though, from here on out.
Okay. Catherine Nadeau of Environmental Advocates of New York, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Nick.